Welcome to Preaching and Teaching the Old Testament. We're going to continue looking at Proverbs. So far we have looked at Proverbs 5:1-23 as an example of admonitions. That was the 8th admonition in the 15 in chapters 1-9. Then we looked at Proverbs 22. That is a general guideline. And today we're going to look at Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Which is a unconditional truth. We also have an example of 3 different types of sermons. When we looked at Proverbs 5, verses 1-23, we did what some would identify as an expository sermon, verse by verse. We got just about everything from that verse, the main point of the sermon, the main divisions, and then the explanation from the main divisions from that text. Proverbs 22 we dealt with topically. We just got the topic from the verse, and then we did a study of comparison between general guidelines and unconditional promise. And Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is going to be a textual sermon. That is, the main point of the sermon comes from the text and the main divisions come from the text, but just about everything else comes outside of the text. So the 3 main divisions will come from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. How can we know the will of God? By trusting in the Lord through salvation, by trusting in the Lord with all our heart, and that would be surrender. And then by saturation, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. So we're going to look at this great promise in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I have part 1, 2, and 3. So I'm just going to highlight. I give an introduction here from the life of John Wesley, how he tried to determine the will of God, not biblically, in the woman that he should marry, and he got in big trouble. We're going to divide this series into 3 parts. Part 1, we're going to make some preliminary statements about the will of God. And part 2, we're going to give the 3 conditions that are necessary to be met. And then part 3, we'll see how God directs when we have responded to those conditions. 3 preliminary statements. I'm just going to highlight these. You will read this post. God's will for your life is knowable. Several verses there support that. God's will is not a bitter dose of medicine. Psalm 40 verse 8 would back that up. God's will is not specifically spelled out in the Bible, but he does give us precepts and principles. We're going to focus on Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and this is part of Proverbs where you have a if-then series. The if you do this, if you meet these conditions, then there will be these consequences. So if you'll look in chapter 2, that's where this conditions and consequences begin. Chapter 2, verse 1, my son, if. Verse 3, if. Verse 4, if. Verse 5, then. There's one more, verse 9, then. If, then. When we get to chapter 3, in these 2 verses, he lays out the conditions, and then when those conditions are met, he says, here are the promises, the consequences. I'm going to go to part 2, and here are the 3 conditions. And again, I'm going to highlight these. You'll read this, and you can get the details. The first condition is you must trust in the Lord. Second condition, you must trust in the Lord with all your heart. And then the third is you must trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. And this word acknowledge means to know. It's used in Genesis 4:25 when Adam knew his wife. And so this is talking about intimate knowledge here. And we can know, we can be saturated with God's word. That's how we will know him. Through precepts or specific commands, such as 1 Thessalonians 4:3, this is the will of God, that you abstain from fornication. And then there's these general guidelines and principles that we've been talking about, as in 1 Corinthians 7:40, marry only in the Lord. But once we meet these conditions, then you have this unconditional truth. He shall direct your paths. That's what we want to just focus here just a little bit. The word direct comes from the Hebrew word yashar, which means to make straight or smooth. It was used in Isaiah 40 verse 3 to predict the future ministry of John the Baptist. But in that Old Testament setting, it was used of when one country wanted to roll out the red carpet for a visiting king, then he would send out the workers who would fill in the potholes, every valley shall be exalted, shape down those big bumps, every mountain and hill shall be made low, and straighten the bends, the crooked shall be made straight. And that verse prophesied the ministry of John the Baptist going before Jesus to spiritually straighten them out, prepare them for the coming Messiah. That word is used in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. He shall direct your path. You remember the contrast of roads? The road of the wise, the road of the foolish. He shall direct your path, make smooth. That doesn't mean the will of God is smooth, but in contrast to, say, the transgressor, like in Proverbs 13:15, the way or the road or the lifestyle of the transgressor is hard. It is harder because of the consequences of sin. But once we meet the conditions of God's word, and specifically in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, then God meets his promises. So I'm going to go to part 3 now and just walk through this. How do we know the will of God? How does God direct us into his will? Through God-given desires. These are like indicators of God's will. Proverbs 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. That matches 1 Timothy 3:1. If any man desire the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. That's one way God keeps his promise of directing us into his will. And then God also directs us into his will by opening doors and closing doors. Paul, in his second missionary journey in Acts 16:6, at that particular point, God closed the door to go south to Ephesus, because God knew on his third missionary journey, Paul would go there and spend an extended time and accomplish probably his greatest work. Wouldn't let him go north to Bithynia because Peter would go there, but he drove him west into Europe. He opened and closed doors. Then God can direct your path through godly counsel. We talked about that last time. It's not foolproof, but it is a way God directs us into his will through the counsel of godly men. Give the example of Jethro giving godly advice to Moses. And these are just the way God keeps his promise that he will direct us into his will. We've seen 3 different kinds of proverbs. The admonition, And then we saw the sentence wisdom or wisdom sentences, basically in two styles: the general principle or guideline, and then the unconditional promise.